In Frances Perkins' early years, American workers, men, women, and children, sweated 70 hours a week under unclean, unsafe, unsanitary conditions.
The men working in the steel mills, there before the blazing hot blast furnaces, an 11-hour day, it was just incredible. And often this would be a 7-day week. And the unions didn't amount to anything.
If you look at factories, women were basically locked in from 7 in the morning till 8 o'clock at night, women and children. They couldn't go to the toilet when they needed to. You saw with women who sewed that they might lose a finger. If you were sick, you were probably fired because there were people who had a baby and would be at work a day later. You know, I mean, that's what you did if you wanted to eat.
One of those who had seen these horrors was former Hull House social worker Frances Perkins. As the New York State Industrial Commissioner under Governor Roosevelt, Perkins had witnessed the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire in New York City. She determined that such a tragedy would never occur again. When Roosevelt moved to the White House, he appointed Perkins to be his Secretary of Labor, the first woman cabinet member in American history.
I imagine this was not an easy appointment for Roosevelt to make, and one of the problems, I guess, that Perkins faced is that she was not coming out of organized labor, and she was a woman. There's a famous picture of Roosevelt signing the Social Security Act, and there are a whole lot of men behind, and there's one woman with a little round hat, looking very serious, and is the only woman in the picture.
Everyone seemed uneasy with the Perkins appointment, even Perkins herself, who was apprehensive and on guard at the first official cabinet meeting. Some of her colleagues seemed unsure that she could speak.
All men and women in the United States who want to see labor take its proper place in American life will earnestly hope and desire that this may be an effective conference to settle all of the difficulties between these two great branches on a practical and permanent basis.
It was a very exciting time. This time of crisis where you had a president who was really going to try to make changes. You were going to be part of planning the changes.
For a government with a soul.
But a government with a soul would be expensive, and fundamental changes would be difficult to sell to Congress. Perkins pushed for laws against child labor and for fair labor practices, reasonable hours, and safe working conditions. But struggling industries depended upon cheap labor. Senator John McClellan made the Southern argument. What profiteth the laborer of the South if he gain the enactment of a wage and hour law, 40 cents per hour and 40 hours per week, if he then lose the opportunity to work? Perkins presented her arguments over the public airwaves, saying that the prosperity of everyone in the country depends upon the ability of the common man to support himself. After a contentious floor fight, the Fair Labor Standards Act was passed in 1938. Americans got the 40-hour work week, the minimum wage, safe factory conditions, and laws to protect children from industrial exploitation. With social work colleagues Harry Hopkins and Jane Hoey, Frances Perkins had moved the profession to center stage, and the federal government accepted its responsibility for the nation's social welfare. A commitment that was to last for nearly 50 years.
In every corner of the battered world, men rejoiced. cheered the end of World War II. The war was over, and American soldiers and sailors couldn't get home soon enough. There were families waiting, and the greatest military machine in history melted as we laid aside our arms.
But the human devastation of war haunted returning World War II veterans.
They were buddies, and they came back with limbs missing, blinded, serious wounds, paraplegics, quadriplegics. There's a sense of guilt, too, about being back. I mean, I lost a lot of friends, and I was a lucky one.
Before the war, Del Anderson had worked with youth in a Cleveland settlement house. But the war set him on a new course.
I felt that I had a responsibility to these buddies of mine who had come out of the war, wounded, disabled, and felt that you had to be part of that program to help them rehabilitate, be restored, and use the remaining capacities they had to live as useful a life and as full a life as they could.
Anderson was drawn to the Veterans Administration, where a grateful nation provided services to those who had served, and where he felt a personal bond.
Here's a person who's lost a leg, or lost an arm, or he's blind, and this is a very traumatic, humiliating experience. So he came with a psychological overlay on a physical handicap.
Trying to understand the links between mind and body developed during the 1920s, as social workers and psychiatrists were seeing the individual as a product of his environment. After the Second World War, this awareness was paying off.
But he tried to unravel both physical and psychological impact on the individual, and then bring them together in a positive, futuristic, forward-looking goal for that veteran. You are wounded, you are disabled, but there's a lot of you left. Your mind is clear, your upper arms are working. There's a lot you can do with what you've got left in the way of a physical body.
The first training responsibility of the Veterans Administration is to restore the employability of service-disabled veterans.
And as you worked and sort of proved this to the veteran, some of the psychological problems, whatever they would be called today, seemed to disappear.
Anderson recalls a particularly challenging situation.
There was a blinded veteran who had been to the program, returned home to his family, and the word came back to the center that he was not adjusting. His family tried to attend to his every need and sort of make up for his loss, which is exactly the opposite kind of an approach they should be using. So I spent several interviews with them talking this out and how the program was designed to help your son become independent. I kept working with the family, and so he went into business and lived a fairly decent life. And so it was kind of exciting to see veterans move from almost total disability to being kind of independent.
By helping vets get their lives back, VA social workers like Del Anderson were becoming linchpins in the rehabilitation process.
There were a lot of concerns about the community services that World War II veterans needed after they were in the hospital. So there was a lot of interest in having social workers look at community programs and look at ways to help the veterans make a smooth transition back into the community.
Historically, doctors had treated social workers as subordinates, unwilling to make them an integral part of the team. Now, that relationship was changing.
Social workers in the VA have a unique opportunity to be part of an interdisciplinary treatment plan. They bring a systems perspective, they bring an ability to facilitate discussion to the team, the treatment team, and make the patient and the patient's family seem more real, so they're not just a body or a body part. They're seen as a whole unique individual with lots of unique needs, in addition to whatever their health care needs are.
As the 1950s ended, the profession was growing in numbers, in services it offered, in respect it was accorded, and in the professional status it enjoyed. As for Del Anderson, he advanced to become the Director of Social Work Service for the VA. Whitney Young was another World War II veteran drawn to social work. Young saw the tragedy of returning black vets held back, not because of injuries, but because of race. He had grown up on the grounds of a boarding school in Shelby County, Kentucky. The Lincoln Institute was a segregated vocational school. His father, a teacher and chief administrator at the school, fought for a better education for his students and for his children.
Whitney Young grew up in a very middle-class background where education and opportunity were promoted.
When World War II came, Young joined the Army. As a non-commissioned officer in Europe, he faced the challenge of having to mediate between his men, an all-black unit, and their white officers.
Now make sure your thumb is alongside your hand, because if it's out here, they may misconstrue it. Then cut the hand sharply to the side. Don't let it drop down like a dead fish.
While in the Army, he honed his negotiating skills.
Whitney Young never saw himself as someone who couldn't make things happen. He could step into the circle of anyone and negotiate, persuade, influence, because he understood the possibilities that this can happen.
Young's journey into social work had begun when he entered a master's program at the University of Minnesota. After graduate school, he got a job with the local Urban League.
The Urban League is a social work agency, primarily looking at housing, employment, access to opportunity. And it started as a response to trying to correct social conditions that people were experiencing as they were migrating north.
What he saw the need for was to find a way to move back the barriers of racism. And the League's agenda would fit into that.
At age 29, he was named director of the League in Omaha, Nebraska, where he stepped up his campaign to expand black employment opportunities.
We were saying to employers, look, if you rule out a whole segment of the labor force on the basis of color, you're missing great opportunity in America. And we were saying to our young people, plan and prepare. If you don't plan and prepare, and there are opportunities, you won't be able to move into them.
In 1954, Young was recruited to serve as dean at the school that E. Franklin Frazier had led. But in 1959, he received a call from the National Urban League, a call he wanted and welcomed.
It was clear that Whitney was the heir apparent, and he just had a natural understanding of human nature. He also understood the need to bring blacks and whites together, government together, corporate America and labor together, that we all had to be in this together. And he did not allow this to become a problem of black folks, but it was a problem of America.
I am Whitney Young, Executive Director of the National Urban League. The Urban League believes that every American should have an equal chance for a good education, a good job, a decent house, and a healthy life.
Young spurred the League to become a part of the growing civil rights movement. He also called upon white America to cast off its stereotypes and prejudices.
He tried to persuade America that let's try to define the best internal strengths that we had, both in people and in the nation, and how to bring those together, and then see what needed to be done. While Martin Luther King was a good and wonderful personal friend, the best speech at the March on Washington was given by Whitney Young.
The evils of the past and the guilt about it cannot be erased by a one-day pilgrimage, however magnificent. Nor can this pilgrimage substitute for an obligation to tomorrow. And so this march must go beyond this historic moment.
Young was able to get everyone's attention.
President Nixon pulled a meeting together of his whole cabinet to hear Whitney Young speak, to talk about our government through all of its resources need to play a larger and more effective role to be able to better relate to many of the challenges and problems. I don't know if that ever happened before or since. Whitney Young had that kind of influence.
At the height of his career, his alma mater honored him. Classmate Del Anderson remembers.
Whitney Young gave the main address. He included a little story about how he almost didn't make it through the University of Minnesota Graduate School of Social Work because of some of the faculty members thought he lacked communication skills. And then he said, "Last week in the Oval Office, talking with President Johnson, I had no problem with my communicative skills."
In March 1971, his busy schedule took him to Nigeria for a conference of the African American Institute.
I remember Jesse Jackson was down there with him. The former Attorney General Ramsey Clark was there, and his wife was also there, and a number of people were down on an international conference. And Whitney drowned. He was out swimming one day with a bunch of people. I know that Ramsey Clark happened to be there with him. And so I was asked by the Urban League to go down to represent them together with one of the board members and the president sent his private plane to go bring Whitney Young's body back. And that was indeed tremendously sad.
Whitney Young brought the humane values of social work into clear focus as the country struggled to achieve the goals of the civil rights movement.
Let the word go forth from this time and place to friend and foe alike that the torch has been passed to a new generation of Americans.
As the 1960s began, the federal government stepped up its efforts to extend the promises of the New Deal.
I recommended new efforts in employment, housing, education, recreation, and community service.
President Kennedy's successor, Lyndon Johnson, declared a war on poverty.
This nation is mighty enough. Its society is healthy enough. Its people are strong enough to pursue our goals in the rest of the world while still building a great society here at home.
With the war on poverty, the federal role in effecting social reform increased as never before. The poor received the promise of Medicaid, food stamps, and subsidized housing.
And there were a number of programs that came about during the 60s, from Head Start and Job Corps, and I always thought that these were programs that neighborhood and community people could access.
But the war on poverty faltered. An era of optimism died in the rice paddies of an obscure Southeast Asian country called Vietnam. The nation's confidence in Washington's ability to solve social problems was shaken.
In the past 8 years, 3 million more people have been added to the welfare rolls. We cannot simply ignore the failures of welfare or expect them to go away. I therefore propose that we abolish the present welfare system.
We have Richard Milhouse Nixon in the White House trying to put an anti-welfare law.
Anna Dumois began her career in New York's Lower East Side, where poverty and poor health care were a way of life. Her colleague remembers the challenge.
There's 300,000 people in this neighborhood called the Lower East Side of Manhattan, which is larger than a city of Richmond, Virginia. And for that community, there were very few health services.
Recognizing the need for local and affordable health care, Dumois began grassroots efforts to organize community health centers.
What we did was to form what we call the Intergroup Health Committee. And the majority of them were people who were receiving supplementary assistance from welfare.
As they campaigned for their neighborhood health centers, Dumois and her committee faced some old barriers.
And what was the resistance in the 60s? Physicians were very, very resistant to patients having any say in the decisions that affected them. The role of the social workers was to help the community people understand not just that they had the right now under the law to participate, but these hospitals could not develop these neighborhood health centers without their participation.
If you are owned by the hospital, they dictate to you what you do, what you don't do, whom can you see, whom you don't see. When the neighborhood owns the center, they are the ones who set up the priorities as to which of the programs that are more important. Is it pediatrics, or is it adult care, or is it AIDS?
In her battle for community health care, Dumois was tenacious.
One of the problems is that everybody wants a quick fix. Everybody believes that you have to have a program today and resolve it tomorrow. I mean, that's not going to happen that way. It's going to take a long time.
The whole view of that the poor are apathetic or don't care about their health and won't go for care was totally disabused when you saw the outcomes. Services were there and people came. And we were there to organize a series of health initiatives. And my mentor, Anna Dumois, organized the first federally funded neighborhood health center controlled by the community in the country.
At the close of the 20th century, large federal initiatives had ended. It was now up to social workers like Anna Dumois to help local communities develop their own programs and services. For over 100 years, Americans have benefited from programs and services fought for by professional social workers.
All right, how's it working?
I like it.
They have won many battles.
Good job.
But the war is not over.
Basically, the one profession which was founded for the purpose of social change and justice was social work. Jane Addams did not create a profession to provide Band-Aids. She created a profession to help immigrants, to help poor people, and to promote social change.
I think our welfare system has really failed the people that it was designed to serve. I think that if we had used many of Richmond's ideas, we would have a welfare system that lifted people out of poverty because people could get what they needed to lift themselves out of poverty. They could get the education that they needed. They could get, if they needed a lot of health care, they could get the health care. If they needed babysitting, if they needed transportation, they could get those things which would help them join the ranks of workers and work their way up the ladder and be a part of the American dream.
As we've come into the new century, I see a growing income gap, which is deeply troubling, and also the erosion of a safety net. Social Security is in trouble. It's difficult getting Social Security disability. The availability of health insurance and the growing number of people who have no health insurance, and for our elderly not to be able to afford prescription drugs in the very country that invented those drugs, I think is the biggest challenges we're facing.
We have lots of people, often in very low-paying jobs, jobs without health insurance, jobs without other kinds of benefits, without security. And I think the challenge now is for more social workers to get involved in making suggestions and changing social policies to deal with the income disparities in the country.
This is the story of social work, and the best social work, I think, is always terribly creative, trying to seek out funding, because there's no free lunch when it comes to the delivery of social services in this country. You have to have resources to do it, and you have to have skilled people power to, in fact, mount these programs.
It's conceivable in every walk of life, from the cradle to the grave. There is the possibility that a social worker can be involved in your life, and oftentimes people associate the social work profession with those who are, quote, the have-nots, but more and more people who are the haves are finding that they can utilize the services of social workers.
We have to work harder. We have to be more convincing. We have to empower and strengthen our people, and we have to do it with more diligence.
This program has been a collaboration between the Council on Social Work Education and the National Association of Social Workers. Financial support was provided by the Brown Foundation of Houston, Texas.